So I've been going to Lancaster Story Slam since the inaugural year of Lancaster Story Slam in 2015. So I've seen a lot of stories. I've seen a lot of storytellers. There are a lot of different kinds of storytellers you see in an experience like this. Sometimes it's someone who treats live storytelling like a craft, like an art that they very lovingly tend to, and they write and they rehearse and they come up here and it's an art form to them. Some people, it's like this story they always tell at parties, and they have this one story and they come up here and they tell their one story and it like brings down the house, which is awesome as well. Sometimes it's someone who it's neither, and what they want to do is they have something they want to get off their chest, and this is sort of like just a very beautifully elevated support group system, and everybody here is so kind that that's also can be a very sweet moment and very special as well. So I've experienced so many of these. It wasn't until last month that I experienced what was certainly the most remarkable live storytelling experience I've ever witnessed in my life, and I can't imagine anything I ever see will ever top it. And I'm going to tell you about that tonight. This is going to be a story about a story slam. I don't know if we've ever done this before. So it was last month, and like I said, I've been going to Lancaster Story Slam for so long, and I've always had an interest in the Moth Story Slam. That was the first version of a story slam I was ever exposed to before I came to Lancaster Story Slam. I'd listen to the podcast and I'd hear it on the radio, and I always wanted to check it out, and I realized, hey, they do the Moth in Philadelphia. I could hop in my car after work someday and just take a quick drive out to Philly, World Cafe Live, and check out the Moth. And I figured I'll bring a story with me just in case. And I thought, I really enjoyed telling my ovarium story here back in February. For those of you who didn't hear it, it's the story of how when my younger brother was in 6th grade, I convinced him that there was an additional phase of puberty that doesn't actually exist, that involves human testicular shedding. Very messy, very, very painful. It can happen at any time without warning. The theme that night at the Moth Story Slam was hot mess. I cannot imagine a better theme for the ovarium story, so I was going to bring my ovarium story. I was really excited. I got there, got my ticket, put my name in the jar, took a seat right in the front row, and enjoyed the show. So storyteller after storyteller took the stage, and every time they go into the jar, they pull out another name. It's not me. It's not me. It's not me. And what I'm realizing, of course, is the venue we're in, World Cafe Live, is quite large. There are at least a couple hundred people there, which means more people in the seats, more names in the jar, worse odds of getting a chance to tell my story. And I'm at peace with that because the storytellers are fantastic and I'm having a great time. And we get all the way to the final storytelling slot. And they reach into the jar and they pull out the name, and they read the name, and the name is Lisa, which is not my name. So I'm kind of bummed out, and this woman comes up to tell her story, and this is not the first kind of storyteller that I mentioned earlier, not the person who treats it like an art form. This is not the person who has one great story that they always tell at parties. This is the person who just really had something that she wanted to get off her chest, and in this case, she's getting it off her chest in front of 200 plus people. And she didn't even know story slams were a thing until a few days earlier when she heard about this. And the reason she came to this particular story slam was because the theme of the night was hot mess, and she felt like her entire life at that time was a hot mess, and she wanted to talk about it. So she came up onto the stage and she was really nervous, she seemed a little shaky, her voice was shaking, and but she was being very brave, and she told her story. So I'll recount some of it to you, at least paraphrase it. This is a woman who had just come out of the very abrupt and unexpected end to a 20-year marriage. Just a few months earlier, the marriage had broken up, and she was telling the story of why that had happened. Her husband of about 20 years, as they were getting into what became the last year of their marriage, she realized that she was starting to suspect that he was being unfaithful to her. He was forming a habit of looking up old girlfriends on Facebook and starting chats with them, and she was noticing a lot more flirting, and he'd go on all of these sort of not very announced and very unspecific work trips that he would come back from, and everything seemed a little fishy. So she decided to do a little investigative work. So what she did was she looked at this bottle of Viagra that he had and used on a regular basis, and she thought, I'm going to take an inventory of how many pills are in this bottle. So she opened the bottle, she counted up about like 12 pills, and then he went on one of his work trips, and when he came back, she counted the pills, and there were about 10 pills in the bottle, which to her was like about as close to a smoking gun as she could get. So when he was getting ready to go on his next work trip, she opened the duffel bag right before he left, she reached in, and she stole the entire bottle of Viagra, so he wouldn't have it. So then he went on the work trip, and while he was there, she called him, and she said, hey, how's the work trip? And he's like, fine. And she's like, oh, by the way, I took your Viagra. And when she said that, he knew exactly what she was accusing him of. He didn't defend himself. He didn't argue back. He didn't apologize. He just said, it's over. Which to her was the ultimate validation of all of her suspicions. Like, he didn't even want to have a conversation. He was just like, we're done. 20 years of marriage, gone. That was the whole story that she intended to tell when she showed up that night. But then she told us something that she hadn't been prepared to share, which is that same night at World Cafe Live, when she got in line to buy her ticket, she looked a few spots behind her in line, and she said, what I didn't expect to see was that a few spots behind me was my ex-husband. And I'm not going to point him out, but he's in the audience right now, is what she said. And at this point, like, this electrical charge just like rippled through the entire, like oh my God, like we had suddenly entered, like we thought we were at like an NPR vibes kind of storytelling event, and suddenly it was like full on Maury Povich, Jerry Springer vibes. Like we were just like, oh, everyone's looking around like, where's this guy? And we all know there's some dude just like melting in his seat. And so she's up there, and the crowd's starting to get worked up, and she was like, so when you betray someone who's been dedicated to you for 20 years of your life, you deserve to know exactly how much you hurt that person, even if you have to hear it on a stage like this in front of hundreds of people. And she like lays down that final like hammer, and the crowd, there was a literal standing ovation. Everyone was on their feet, like people were like screaming. This woman, who again had never even heard of a story slam, won the story slam that night, went home with the final prize, like it was like unanimous. It was just like, because they actually give you this, you see the scores there, so it was just like 10, 10, 10, and every judge just like perfect, like, and just such a glorious moment. That dude, I can only imagine him slinking out of that place. So, like I said, I've seen a lot of stories. I've been to a lot of story slams. The most remarkable and strongest story slam I've ever experienced was delivered by a woman named Lisa. And I'm not going to point her out, but she's in the room right now. Fucking with you guys, she's not actually here. But I wanted to do that so bad after I heard her story that I was like, I'm going to come up here and pretend that that's true. That's my story. Thanks for listening.